I stood in the cold winter night, staring through the window as snowflakes drifted heavily outside. The chill seeped into every corner of my house, but the cold didn't compare to the frustration I felt as I looked next door. Through the thick falling snow, I could see Lena Caldwell, the HOA president, casually enjoying her oversized pool while the rest of us were stuck battling the freezing temperatures. From my window, I saw her draining my water into her pool like it was no big deal wasting resources, while I struggled to keep my house from freezing. Why? Because her pool couldn't stay warm without water that I was paying for, while my own house had no hot water left. My water bills had been climbing steadily, and I was barely making ends meet. But tonight, everything was going to change. I exhaled slowly, a small grin creeping across my face. It's time for her to pay, I muttered under my breath as my hand hovered over the newly installed faucet. Lena wouldn't know what hit her. Lena Caldwell wasn't just the HOA president. She was the self-appointed ruler of Willowbend, the kind of woman who treated the neighborhood bylaws like holy scripture and enforced them like a tyrant. Her every move was calculated, each decision meant to strengthen her control over the community. She used the HOA to manipulate everyone, from making sure everyone's lawn was trimmed, to her liking, to imposing fines for the smallest infractions, all while pretending to be the friendly face of suburban leadership. But behind the polished smile and impeccable attire was a woman who felt entitled to everything around her. Her backyard was a testament to that. A massive, sparkling pool, even in the dead of winter, while the rest of us were left scraping by. She didn't care that the drought had pushed everyone else to conserve water. Her pool was sacred, her right to fill it infinite. I'd lived here long enough to know the HOA's dirty little secrets, but Lena's actions were the last straw. I'd watched her grow bolder, stealing water from me as if it were her God-given right. When I first confronted her, she had that smooth, rehearsed smile on her face, but I could see the panic in her eyes for a split second. She knew what she was doing was wrong, but she didn't care. The rules never applied to her. It started slow, just a creeping sense that something was off. At first, I dismissed it as nothing more than the usual nuisance of utility bills. But when I checked the water bill in early December, I had to sit down. $315 for water. I live alone, for God's sake. I'm not running a water park out here. The next month, it hit $340, and the month after that, $368. This slow, steady increase was like a gnawing tick, feeding off my bank account without giving me a chance to stop it. I started looking for leaks, double-checking every faucet and every pipe. Nothing. The water usage in my house was the same as always, minimal. But there was no denying it. Something wasn't right. Then, one evening, I happened to glance out the window, half expecting the usual quiet. But this time, there she was, Lena, leaning over my side fence, the one that divides our yards by a narrow, barely visible alley. She was tugging my garden hose through the gap in the fence, just like it was an everyday thing. I froze, watching as the green hose snaked under the fence and disappeared into her yard. It took me a second to piece it together. Her pool, the one she'd built last year, that obnoxiously oversized monstrosity she called a luxury water feature. No one in Willowbend had a pool that big, not in this climate. And yet, there it was, glistening in all its gaudy blue glory, just waiting to be filled. And I realized she'd been siphoning my water. No wonder my bills were skyrocketing. The more I thought about it, the more it pissed me off. I hadn't known it at the time, but I'd started watching her more out of curiosity than anything else. I didn't want to be that guy who got all paranoid about his neighbors, but I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The late-night water usage, the weird little leaks on her side of the fence. It all clicked. I needed proof. So I did what any sensible person would do. I rigged up a camera, not a fancy one, just an old infrared trail cam I'd used for deer hunting last summer. It wasn't much, but it was enough to capture the footage I needed. 2 days later, I had it. At 6 a.m., just as the first hint of daylight broke the horizon, Lena, dressed in her usual silk robe and oversized sunglasses, was caught on tape. There she was, tugging at my hose like a pro, her arms pulling it through the gap in the fence with practiced ease. She connected it to her pool and, without a care in the world, turned the water on. I watched in stunned silence as she filled that damn thing with my water. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a one-time thing. This was deliberate, a regular routine, and I had the footage to prove it. I didn't want to confront her, not yet. I hated confrontation, but this had gone too far. I wasn't just angry anymore. I was incensed. This was theft. But it wasn't just the stolen water that pushed me over the edge, it was the fact that Lena thought she could get away with it without facing any consequences. She had been using my water for months, maybe longer, and all the while, she'd been playing the role of the friendly neighborhood leader, hosting HOA meetings, smiling at the block parties. The very same woman who had the audacity to charge fines for things like improperly stored garden hoses was now stealing water, and I was the one paying the price. It hit me hard when I checked the water bill again. $400. For a month. I was paying for her luxury pool, for the maintenance of her little suburban paradise. While my own house sat cold and empty, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to do something. But what? I couldn't just march over to her house and demand she pay up. That wouldn't be enough. I needed something more satisfying, more creative. I spent the next day at the county assessor's office, rummaging through old maps and records. Vending machine, coffee, and a seething sense of injustice fueled me as I dug into the municipal archives. And that's when I found it. A piece of paper buried in a stack of dusty files, my property, Lot 14B, was never officially annexed into the Willow Bend Estates HOA. Apparently, the original owner, an old woman named Ruth, had refused to join the HOA when the neighborhood was first developed. She'd insisted on a grandfather clause that exempted her property from all HOA bylaws. The clause was ironclad, and it applied to me. The realization hit me like a freight train. I wasn't just a neighbor anymore. I was legally untouchable. Every fine, every nuisance complaint, every citation Lena had thrown my way was legally void. All I had to do now was play it smart, wait for her to push me too far, and then I would hit her where it hurt. But first, I needed to let her get bolder. I wanted her to escalate, to think she could keep doing this without consequence. I had a plan, and when it was time, she would regret underestimating me. The authorities were about to make their entrance. I had already gathered evidence footage of Lena stealing my water, as well as the skyrocketing water bills that clearly indicated something fishy was going on. But I knew this wasn't enough to make the HOA or Lena back down. I had to turn up the heat. First, I called the county water department. I had to get their attention, and I knew they would take the violation seriously. The city had drought restrictions in place. They were actively encouraging people to conserve water. And here was Lena, using my water to fill her pool without a care in the world. I didn't waste time being polite. I pointed out the ridiculous increase in my water bills and linked it directly to Lena's actions. I made sure to stress that, under the current conditions, her blatant wastefulness was unacceptable. I could hear the clerk on the other end of the line pause when I mentioned the illegal use of water. That's when I knew I had them. The ball was in motion. Next, I reached out to a lawyer, someone with experience dealing with property disputes and HOA cases. I wasn't just going to let Lena get away with this. I needed to know exactly what legal recourse I had. The lawyer was helpful, confirming that my property was legally exempt from HOA authority due to the grandfather clause. This was the ace up my sleeve. Lena had no idea. She thought I was just another ordinary resident, an easy target. But now, I knew I could hit her hard, legally and financially. As I worked the legal angle, I also started talking to my neighbors. I wasn't going to fight this battle alone. I reached out quietly, making sure to speak to the right people, those who'd seen Lena's behavior firsthand. At first, they were reluctant to get involved. The HOA was powerful, and challenging it felt like an uphill battle. But when I showed them the footage of Lena's thievery, everything changed. Suddenly, I wasn't alone. The pressure was building. The HOA's wheels were turning, and soon, Lena's facade would come crashing down. The point of no return arrived in a letter. The HOA was coming to inspect my property. On the surface, it looked like a routine inspection for improper hose storage. But I knew exactly what this was. It was retaliation, pure and simple. Lena had been pushing for this ever since I confronted her. She wanted me to back down, to be afraid of her power. She wanted to send a message that anyone who crossed her would be dealt with, but I wasn't going to cower. I felt a wave of cold anger wash over me. This was it. They had pushed me too far, and I was ready to push back harder. The moment I got that letter, I made the call to Cal. I didn't even hesitate. Cal had worked with me on plenty of things before, always the quiet, reliable type. When I explained what I needed, he didn't ask for details. He just said, "I'm in, let's do this." And that was the thing with Cal. He wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty, especially when it came to making things right. That evening, Cal and I met in my backyard. We huddled by the old faucet where I had planned my revenge. I showed him the layout, and we got to work. Cal had the connections to local sewage and drainage systems, and I knew he'd be the perfect partner for this. The plan was simple but brilliant. I was going to reroute my gray water supply into Lena's pool. It was legal, it was genius, and most importantly, it would make her regret every moment she'd stolen from me. We worked well into the night, the icy wind biting at our hands as we laid down the pipes, connected the valves, and set up the necessary equipment. I had already installed a dual valve fitting with a vacuum breaker to ensure that the water wouldn't backflow into my own system. Everything was in place. All that was left was for Lena to continue her usual routine, blissfully unaware of the trap I'd set. By morning, the system was ready. The hose from my house would no longer supply fresh water to her pool. It would supply something far more memorable. Gray water, the runoff from my laundry, shower drains, and the kitchen sink. It wasn't toxic, but it wasn't clean either. The smell, once it hit her, would be unbearable. As I stood back, looking at the setup, I knew I had her. She would take the water just like always. But this time, it was going to backfire. The thought of her face when she realized what was happening made me grin. That afternoon, I heard the hum of Lena's landscaper pulling into her driveway. I'd been expecting it. The man had been part of Lena's operation for months, sneaking onto my property to steal my water. Today, he was about to make the mistake of his life. I watched from the window, holding my breath, as he made his way to the fence, looking left and right, like a criminal caught in the act. He reached for the hose, just as I'd planned, connecting it to Lena's pool filtration system. I could barely contain my excitement. I sat at my desk, clicking the record button on my surveillance system. Every moment was captured, and I had a front row seat to watch Lena's reaction when her pool started filling up with something far worse than water. The moment had come. I walked into the Willow Bend Community Center for the emergency HOA meeting, my heart pounding with anticipation. The usual crowd was there, silent, tense, with their eyes flicking nervously between Lena and me. Lena sat at the head of the table, flanked by her usual entourage, Greg, her sunburned husband, and Cheryl, the ever-loyal board treasurer. Lena tried to hide her nervousness, but I could see it. Her face was pale, her grip tight on her designer water bottle, and her lips twisted into a forced smile as I walked up to the front. But it wasn't going to work this time. She had no control anymore. I didn't need to say anything. I just dropped the milk crate full of evidence onto the table with a satisfying thud. The room went dead silent as I plugged my laptop into the projector. The screen flickered to life, and the first slide appeared. The truth was about to hit her like a freight train. The first video played, showing Lena's landscaper sneaking into my yard and pulling my hose through the gap in the fence. It was crystal clear, time-stamped, and undeniable. The camera zoomed in as he connected it to Lena's pool. There were gasps from the room. I let the video speak for itself. Next, I pulled up my water bill history. The numbers were staggering: $315, $340, $368, all rising with each instance of Lena stealing my water. I could feel the tension growing as the crowd began to connect the dots. Then, I pulled up the city records, proving that Lena's house had the lowest water usage in the entire neighborhood, while I had been paying a small fortune. I saw it in her eyes: fear, panic. Her control was slipping away. Lena stood up abruptly, knocking her chair back in the process. Her face was red, and her voice cracked as she attempted to defend herself. "This is all a misunderstanding," she exclaimed. "This footage is tampered with." The room wasn't buying it. Mr. Bennett, the HOA vice president, finally spoke up, his voice shaking. "Lena, this is serious. We need to look at this. This is more than just water theft. It's a violation of multiple HOA regulations. I am stores." The room grew louder, murmurs of disbelief rippling through the crowd. They were starting to see the truth. Cheryl, who had always been Lena's right-hand woman, stood up, her voice trembling but clear. "If Lena is doing this, where's the HOA's money going?" she asked. "This isn't just water. What's happening to the funds?" The question hung in the air. I clicked to the next slide, revealing documents Cal and I had uncovered. $48,000 of HOA funds had been diverted to Lena's landscaping projects. The pool, the lavish garden, everything was built on stolen dues. Lena's face drained of color. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. The room erupted in chaos. People started talking over each other, and the board members exchanged looks of disbelief. Lena's empire, built on manipulation and deceit, was crumbling in front of everyone. It didn't take long for the community to react. The silence in the room was thick, but as the truth sank in, people started to speak up. Neighbors who had once been too scared to challenge Lena now began to find their voices. Whispers of, "I knew something wasn't right," spread like wildfire. Some even came up to me after the meeting, thanking me for standing up to Lena and bringing everything to light. The atmosphere in the room had shifted dramatically. The tension that had been hanging over Willowbend for so long was finally dissipating. The community was no longer living under the thumb of an oppressive leader. Lena's reign was over, and people were starting to breathe easy again. I didn't need to say anything, just walking out of that room, head held high, was enough. The weight that had been pressing down on me for months, maybe even longer, had lifted. I could finally think clearly again. The constant worry over my water bills, the anxiety of dealing with Lena's threats, it was all gone. I felt a wave of relief I hadn't known I needed. As I walked out of the meeting, I couldn't help but feel a strange sense of vindication. But there was still more to come. The fallout from Lena's actions was far from over. In the days following the meeting, the legal consequences began to unfold. Lena was hit with fines not just for the water theft, but also for misappropriating HOA funds. The board, now in full rebellion against her, made it clear that they would not tolerate her actions any longer. She was forced to resign as HOA president, and the city launched an investigation into the $48,000 she'd funneled into her personal landscaping projects. Lena's pool was shut down immediately for safety violations. It wasn't just a biohazard anymore, it was a symbol of everything wrong with her leadership. The county required her to foot the bill for the decontamination and repairs, a hefty price she had to pay out of her own pocket. I didn't just get justice for myself, I got it for the whole community. No more secrets, no more manipulation. The HOA would never be the same again. It didn't stop there. The final touch, the cherry on top, came in the form of karma. Weeks after Lena was ousted, I drove by her house one afternoon. The usual pristine lawn was now a chaotic mess. Her pool, once a symbol of her unchecked power, was empty, the liner peeling and the tiles cracked. It was like watching a queen's throne fall into disrepair. What really caught my attention, though, was the small "for sale" sign that now stood on her front lawn. The once untouchable Lena, who had treated her neighbors like pawns in a game of power, was finally being forced to leave. The sign wasn't just a marker of her departure, it was the culmination of everything that had happened. The neighborhood was reclaiming what was rightfully theirs. As I parked my car and walked back to my house, I felt a deep sense of peace. I wasn't just walking into my home, I was walking into a future where the people in Willowbend could finally breathe again. There would be no more drone surveillance, no more harassment over trivial matters, just neighbors helping neighbors, as it should have been all along. Later that evening, I stood in my backyard, watching my newly installed fountain gently gurgle in the evening breeze. It wasn't the same as the revenge faucet, but it was better. It symbolized a new era, one where I wasn't fighting a losing battle against a tyrant. The peaceful sound of the water brought a quiet satisfaction. This was the life I'd fought for, and when the wind blew just right, I couldn't help but smile, remembering the lesson learned. What you take from your neighbors always has a way of flowing back to you. Looking back, the win wasn't what mattered most. In the heat of everything, it would have been easy to act out of pure anger, especially with how Lena had pushed me. But as much as I wanted to, I knew that real change only comes through the legal process, not through revenge or petty escalation. In the end, it was the evidence, the proper channels, and following the law that won the day. It's important to understand where the line is. Standing up for what's right, standing up for yourself, is necessary. But it's a very different thing to escalate emotionally or take actions that are unlawful. In this case, I didn't let my frustration cloud my judgment. I gathered evidence, and I let the authorities handle the rest. It wasn't about getting even, it was about doing what was necessary and fair. If you ever find yourself in a similar situation, remember, document everything. Keep records, pay attention to public filings, and if you need to, involve an attorney or the right authorities. It might seem like a hassle, but it's always better than acting impulsively. You'll get results that are more lasting, and it'll help you avoid a situation spiraling out of control. The strength of any community lies in its respect for the law. When people overstep, like Lena did, it disrupts the balance. In the end, the power of the HOA isn't in the hands of one person, it's in the shared respect for fairness. As I stand by my garden, watching the gentle flow of the fountain, I realize that doing things right makes all the difference. No shortcuts, just integrity.